Well, Shabbat Shalom and welcome. This is VBS Torah Study for Shabbos, Shabbos Vayechi, the last Shabbos of 2023, a very, very difficult year for many of us. And I welcome you to our learning this morning. Welcome, Mark. It's good to have you again. Hope you're doing okay.
I am. Happy New Year. I guess we could say good Yontif in a
We
way.
could say a good yontif at the beginning of a new year. The
Yes.
Torah portion this week is about endings. It's about the end of the book of Genesis. Vayechi is the last part of the book of Genesis, and it's the end of the story of our people as a family. Next week, when we begin the book of Shemot, we begin our national epic as a community, as a people. So the family is going to the story of the people as a family. It's the death of Father Jacob, the last of the patriarchs, the death of Joseph, who brought us down into Egypt and prospered there. And in addition to these two deaths that are described in the Torah portion, and the sort of culmination of this chapter of our existence, it's interesting that this week we commemorate the 51st yahrzeit of the great philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel, and conclude this 50th year since his passing. Heschel, when he was alive, was very popular in the Protestant and Catholic communities, but not nearly as attended to and read and studied in the Jewish community. The Jewish community didn't know exactly what the hell to do with him. It's only in the years since he's died when the whole expression of religion as spirituality has risen in our community that Heschel has become the principal philosopher for American and diaspora Jewish life, and in Israel as well now, as well because Tikkun Olam has taken such a center place in our Jewish lives. Heschel also becomes the sort of personification, the hero, and the photograph, which everybody has seen, of Heschel marching with Martin Luther King in Selma becomes the sort of iconic image of our American Jewish experience. So, Mark, as we mark this as this yahrzeit, we'll come back to the Torah portion in a moment. But as we mark this yahrzeit, tell me about Heschel. Heschel's been very important in my development as a Jew and as a rabbi. Tell me about yours.
Well, I think let's start with his historical importance. Heschel is the reason that conservative Judaism really was able to be successful in America. Because what happened was Heschel was saved from England and, well, actually from Germany.
Poland and Germany, right?
Yeah, where he had done his doctorate at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums. And he had done all of this work in there, and he was the scion of the Apter Rav, famous rabbi, famous Hasidic rabbi and dynasty. And it was Hebrew Union College that got him out of there and emancipated him and brought him to Cincinnati to teach at Hebrew Union College, the rabbinical school. Well, he looked around and he saw how Reform Judaism didn't really want to root itself in any meaningful way in halacha, particularly kashrut, but also Shmirat Shabbat, the observance of Sabbath, basically mitzvahs. But so he was very frustrated with seeing that, and he immediately quit. And he went to New York. And from 1945 until his death in 1972, Heschel was the professor of, get this, ethics and mysticism.
Right.
Now, there are not two things that are more different
Mm-hmm.
than ethics and mysticism, but he put them together. But his arrival at JTS was like the Dodgers signing Shohei Ohtani. That since Heschel, there hasn't been that big an event that happened to make an institution amazing. And so JTS owes a great deal to Heschel's enormous star power academic excellence that he brought to the seminary. The other part about Heschel, I don't mean this to be critical, but Heschel was not really a theologian. He was a poet, in my view. He did a theologian, like, say, the pure Jewish theologian, Maimonides, was systematic. It was first principles, 13 principles. These are the things we believe. This is this. It's very turgid, very thick, very difficult. It isn't in any way inspiring. It's just systematic. But that's how theology works. It's a form of philosophy. But Heschel wasn't interested in that. Heschel was interested in inspiring people, like you say, to what we now call spirituality. And so he would write with unbelievable power, and his writings were just so inspirational. And they would sing. He was just gifted in his use of prose. And so the stories of Heschel are really, in a certain way, the most important legacy. And his students, Reuven Kimmelman and others who teach about his presence there. My friend Richard Newhouse, may his memory be blessed, Protestant minister who converted to Catholicism and formed the journal First Things, and was a very close friend of Heschel. They had a Passover Seder every year together. They all loved the stories of what they called Father Abraham. They used to call him that. So I'd like to share, and I'd like to hear your Heschel stories. But my favorite Heschel story is one that nobody knows, because it was a private story told to me by David Novak, Jewish theologian and a friend, and he studied with Heschel for a couple of years. And they were studying the Talmud, and they studied some sugya about how if an egg has blood in it, it's not kosher because it's mixing, and it's all of a sudden flesh. So and it's treif. So he said at the end of the teaching about blood in an egg, he said, "Gentlemen, you are now experts in identifying blood in an egg. May you be just as expert in recognizing blood in money." So powerful, so perfect, and so Heschel. And his daughter Susanna has done wonderful work in collecting the stories, and there's a wonderful volume about Heschel that she put together. And of course, the other famous Heschel story that everyone knows, there's several versions of this, and they differ slightly, but they all come to the same point, that in the march from Selma to Montgomery with Martin Luther King, that Heschel participated in, supposedly some racist reporter accosted him because he looked like a rabbi. He had a big white beard, and he looked like a rabbi. I don't. Let's face it. I look like the guy who says, "I'm sorry, your mortgage has not been approved." but Heschel looked like a rabbi. So this reporter comes up to him and says, "Rabbi, what are you doing here?" And he says, "Well, I'm praying." And just to get rid of him. And the reporter says, "Well, Rabbi, I've been watching you, and I haven't seen your lips move." So Heschel looked at him again and said, "I'm praying with my feet." And that's a great Heschel story and a famous one. What are your favorite Heschel stories?
Well, so before I get to the stories, I'm going to demur from your two major conclusions, because I see Heschel differently. First of all, in terms of his history, the history of Abraham Joshua Heschel is that he's consistently a fish out of water. In whatever environment he found himself, he was an outsider. First, he was an outsider in the Hasidic community that raised him because he was so intellectually far and above what
Yeah.
that community could offer. That's why his family sent him to a secular high school and then allowed him to go to Berlin to go to university. And here he finds himself in Berlin, in the capital of Western European culture, Central European culture, absorbing music and art and philosophy. But he's still a very religious man. We have his poetry from that point of his life. And it reflects on the anguish of his soul to try to reconcile these two parts of his character. And then he comes to America, and you're exactly right. He was rescued by Hebrew Union College. And it was just a totally foreign environment for him. I mean, they were incredibly gracious in rescuing him, giving him a place to live, giving him a job. They made him a Hebrew teacher. And, having him as a Hebrew teacher is like having Einstein as an arithmetic teacher. I mean, he's an incredible scholar of Judaism because he didn't speak English yet. He only spoke German and Yiddish and Italian and French. So they didn't quite know what to do with him. Um, and then he comes to JTS. And here, you're right, JTS, since his death, has taken a lot of credit for him. But during his lifetime, he was not beloved there. In fact, the
Really?
faculty,
I
yes,
didn't know that.
well, because the faculty of JTS, the theme of JTS when he was there was this scientific study of Talmudic texts, which is,
Yeah.
on the one hand, very Wissenschaft. They're very German in its outlook. And in terms of its Jewish life, was profoundly Litvak. That's profoundly devoted to halacha, to the observance of law. And here's this man who's a chassid. The title that they gave him, professor of mysticism and ethics, they refused to call him a professor of philosophy because they didn't believe he knew anything. And he spends his
Right.
whole life trying to prove that he knows an awful lot of Judaism. And mysticism in that context was not a compliment. Mysticism, I mean, there's a very famous story that the very famous scholar of Jewish mysticism, Gershon Scholem, once came to give a lecture, and the students ran up to Professor Lieberman, who was the great dean of the college, of the seminary, and they said, "What are you having him speak? This is Narishkeit. Narishkeit is Yiddish for nonsense." And Lieberman's answer reportedly is Narishkeit, but the study of Narishkeit is science. And but Narishkeit's nonsense is the way that he was seen by the faculty, and he was a terrible classroom teacher. The students didn't like his classes because he didn't know how to be a professor. He wanted to be a rebbe, and he looked for disciples. And you're exactly right. What he did was gather around himself a small, small circle of very devoted students. Sam Dresner was the first one. Um, Art Green, Reuven Kimmelman, some of the great, who later became the great leaders of American Jewish life, because they gravitated to his personality, to his spirituality, to his way of teaching. Um, the second thing that's, I think, important is the question of whether he's a theologian. And I'm sorry, one more point. The reason the fish out of water, and the reason he writes the theology he writes, is because here he's living as a deeply religious man in a deeply secular society, in a society that privileges science as a way of knowing. For Heschel, religion is a way of knowing the world, but it's a way of knowing the world that modernity does not privilege and does not even understand, and sees religion as superstition, as mysticism, as otherworldly. And he's trying to explain himself. That's what his whole philosophical task is, to try to explain the inner life of a religious person to a secular scientific community that had lost touch with that part of itself. And his theology, or his writing, whether you want to call it theology or philosophy or poetry, don't mind calling it theology, because theology has to adjust to the material it's dealing with, and his understanding of religion doesn't lend itself to systematic writing. But whatever you want to call it, it's all about trying to explain himself. So the very famous story is that every lecture would begin, he would whisper into the microphone, "Ladies and gentlemen, a great miracle just happened." And whether it was a college or a seminary or a university or a conference, people would like listen, like, what happened? And he'd say, "The sun just went down." And people would look at him like he's crazy. And then he'd begin to talk about how a religious person appropriates the world. How does a religious person experience the world? We experience the world. Religious people experience the world, said Heschel, through the eyes of wonder, through a sense of the oh wow, through the ability to be surprised even at the most mundane things. And in that, said Heschel, in that, he begins to unravel what's in him and try to offer us a way to appropriate that kind of religious outlook. That's what his theology is trying to do. So you're right, it's not systematic and it's not logical, it's experiential. It's the same way that if you tried to explain to somebody what falling in love is all about, you wouldn't write a logical, systematic, mathematically proven treatise. You'd invite people into the experience. And that's what Heschel's thought is doing. And he did it better than anybody. And it
Yes,
took
he did.
about 30 years after his death before the Jewish community began to really understand what he was trying to say. And now he's become the most popular Jewish thinker in the world. Um, Ironically, many, many years after his passing.
He was amazing. He was really a polymorph. He understood so many different things on so many different levels. But as you said wonderfully, he never really fit in. He was very close to being a Jewish heretic. Very, very
Well, in
close.
many ways, he was. I mean, some of his essays, you stop and you have to read the essay very carefully. And his writing, you're right about this. His writing is elusive. It's elusive also. It points to things, but it's elusive. You can't pin him down because he's there's a Hasidic temper to this. It's a sense in which he's inviting you into an experience that he can't fully define. He can only invite you in and show you the way. His best friends in the world were non-Jews. His best friends in the
Like
world were
Richie.
Martin Luther King and Reinhold Niebuhr, the great Protestant theologian, because they were deeply religious men. And Heschel didn't find anyone in the Jewish world who could resonate with the religiosity inside of him.
That's right.
Right? He had very, very prominent Hasidic relatives. They didn't get him, and he didn't get them. And on the other hand, he couldn't understand secular American Jewish life. His across the hallway, his office was on the sixth floor of the seminary office building. My dear teacher, Neil Gilman, inherited his office. So this office reeked of cigar smoke. Um, and right across the hallway was the office of Mordecai Kaplan. So the two men were very close friends. They would greet each other at the doorway. They're both heretics, ride the elevator up, each retreat to his office, write terrible things about each other, right? See each other for lunch, right? Walk home together. There was a deep respect for each other because their religiosity was so different. Heschel's religiosity is experiential, it's mysticism, it's what we call spirituality. And Kaplan's is logical, rational, natural. Heschel thought that Kaplan was the worst of American Judaism because he removed religiosity from the experience of Jewish life and made it sociology. And Kaplan thought that Heschel was the worst because it was nonsense. It was you couldn't understand what he was saying. It was supernatural and out of this world and contrary to the way that science sees the world. And so the two men, it was a kind of a paradox. They were very respectful and affectionate with each other, but saw Jewish life completely different. Kaplan's philosophy dominated American Judaism through the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s. Heschel began in the 80s, 90s, and now in the 2000s to be the dominant philosophy.
Yeah, that's wonderfully summed up. I think that's all right. And I think that ultimately they were both after a question that, unless we answer it, or at this point in our lives, our children answer it, we're not going to survive. And that is, what do Jews believe?
Yeah.
What do we really believe? It's one thing to say, okay, you're Jewish if your mother's Jewish, or however you define our ethnic identity. But that wasn't even Kaplan's view. You know, we're a people with a kind of spiritual mission, but not a chosenness. But there was still in the idea of Am Yisrael, there was some profound theological takeaway for Kaplan. But for Heschel, who I am much closer to in this belief, it was about God. It was all about God.
Right.
It was, prayer wasn't us, was not, as he famously said, where we called to God, but prayer is where God calls to us. And what does that mean, God calls to us when we pray? Well, it could mean lots of things, but the point that Heschel was making, that I take deeply, is that unless Judaism is about God and God's working through us in the world, then nothing else matters. And why should we do this? Because Kaplan's view that there is a kind of sanctity of our folk ways, of our cultural patterns, and that all, I know what the cultural patterns of Jews are. I live in the middle of it, and so do you. And Encino and Boca Raton are not going to sustain our people into the future. It's just that simple. Our folkways include going for Chinese food on Christmas, and that's just the way it is. So we have to find a way to return to God, to let God live in our lives and the lives of our children, and to take the lessons of both Tanakh and also of the Talmud and integrate them into our lives in a way that sustains us, particularly that sustains us during difficult times. And that raises an issue, because of Heschel, that I wonder about given the war in Gaza, because the question is not been raised in anything I've read so far about the war. The question has not been raised, what does God want from us in this? What is the divine, the spiritually authentic response to being savagely attacked like we were? What are we supposed to do? And how are we supposed to use God to sustain our hope in the midst of this war? And I don't see people addressing that. I see 1,000 essays about the rise of anti-Semitism. I see thousands of essays about how Israel is getting pressured unfairly to surrender this war. I see all of that, and they all have their place. But to me, there's something missing here. And that is, what should be the spiritual response to the war?
Wow. So let's go back each thing, because I want to answer the question, but I want to go back for a second. So
Okay.
a couple of weeks ago, we commemorated the yahrzeit of my teacher, Harold Schulweis, who was a
Oh,
student of Kaplan, very close student of Kaplan. I actually have a file of their correspondence, which begins right after Schulweis graduated seminary and continues up until the day of Kaplan's death.
you should publish that.
It's an interesting set of letters. Schulweis, however, differed from his teacher. He departed from his teacher in a very exactly in the area you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Kaplan writes this famous book, Judaism and Civilization, 1934, because he's talking to second generation American Jews whose parents had immigrated, who had then become assimilated into America, who were still very Jewish, but had given up Jewish religion because they found America. They found American science, American sociology, American culture, and the great symbol of that assimilation was an institution founded by Felix Adler, who was the son of the greatest Reform rabbi in the world. And he crossed the park. His father was the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel. He crossed
Cyrus.
and he crossed the park, and he built the Society for the Advancement of Ethical Culture, which is Judaism stripped of its religion, right? Kaplan objects to this and says, no, I don't have to give up my sense of Jewishness if even though I want to give up the superstitions of traditional religion. And so he creates Reconstructionism based on the idea that we are first a people and our first loyalty is to our peoplehood. And right around the corner, he founds the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, right around as a response to Adler, right? It was a very interesting conversation. And Kaplan's great Copernican revolution, he called it, is moving Judaism from centered on belief to centered on belonging. And it becomes terribly popular in the 40s and 50s and 60s when American Jews, number one, now we go through a second and a third generation of assimilation, and we don't want to be that different from our neighbors. And number two, the reality of radical evil from the Holocaust shakes our faith. And so what's left is a sense of Jewishness. I grew up in a home like this, Jewishness. It's an attachment to the Jewish people. Schulweis departed from Kaplan because he said Jewishness without Jewish belief is bagels and lox and Fiddler on the Roof and oi 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 Yiddish affectations without a core of ethical commitment and philosophical truth.
Absolutely right.
And Heschel agreed with that. I mean, Schulweis and Heschel were at odds also, but the idea that what Heschel was trying to say back to Kaplan was that what you said a moment ago so articulately, we have to have a truth. We have to believe in something. We have to stand for something and not just our attachment to our people. Yes, attachment to people is important, but that is instrumental. It's secondary to an attachment to a truth that we hold on to. Maimonides puts this out with great power. For Maimonides, Judaism is truth.
Yes.
And the question is, what is the truth? What is that core of belief? What is that philosophical way of looking at the world that is at the core of our Judaism that our peoplehood is there to celebrate? And that's the
exactly right.
question that Schulweis asked Kaplan. It's a question that Heschel challenged Kaplan very powerfully. And that's what happened. In the 1980s, you had a third and a fourth generation of American Jews. I'm a third generation, fourth are my kids, who are now so comfortable in America, I don't have to be embarrassed to be Jewish anymore. You're right. I'm not embarrassed. I'm not afraid, right? Even with the anti-Semitism, I'm not afraid. But I want to know what I believe in. They started asking the question, why be Jewish? Which is the one question Kaplan couldn't answer because he assumed it. But why be Jewish is a question that Heschel starts with. And that's exactly why Heschel takes preeminence as the philosophical moment in the late 20th, early 21st century. And you're exactly right. I think that's a question we must be asking. What do we believe in?
Right. And the thing that tips it to, I think, to Heschel's side in this debate is the impoverishment of American culture. It's one thing in 1932, before the great tremendum, as Arthur Cohn called it, for the Holocaust. It's easy to say we're in love with American culture. and we want to be completely undifferentiated Americans. But when American culture is filled with the dross that it is filled with today, and I don't want to start a debate about what's what and, about popular music or about the tsunami of pornography that's sweeping, or basically the division of our culture into little warring tribes. Whatever parts of the collapse of American culture you choose is fine with me. The result is the same. There's a strong reason not to assimilate into this. There's a strong reason to say we have to keep at least spiritually a hand's breadth away from that culture and build up within our own consciousness and the consciousness of our children the notion that we're here to do God's will in this broken world, and that will expresses itself both in public acts of compassion and social justice, but it also works in terms of our own understanding that we are accompanied in our journey of life and death, and that death is not the end of us, and that there is hope, always hope, because we are accompanied by a God who loves us. That idea sustains people through collapsing cultures. It sustains people through difficult times, and it sustains people through personal tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe, and I believe that, and I've seen it, and I wouldn't be a rabbi if I didn't believe it. And whenever I see young rabbis who have huge theological doubts about God, I just pray silently that God give them another job. Give them something to do where they can believe in what they do, but not this. We need rabbis who believe in this
In
in
stuff.
order to work.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I wouldn't put it in terms of pushing away American culture, because I'm swimming in it too deeply. But I put it this
So am
way.
I. So am I.
There are gaps in American culture. And what Judaism can do for us is help us fill those gaps. And the gap that you've spoken about, which is so powerful, is this enormous gap about the question of meaning. Why am I here? What am I here for? How
Yes.
should I spend? American culture gives us liberty, gives us the opportunity to do things that our ancestors could dream about. So many things, so much power, so much liberty, so much opportunity. But American culture doesn't give you the foggiest idea what to do with that liberty, how to invest it, how to spend it, what to devote it to, what I'm here in the world, and where do I find a sense of that deep sense of satisfaction with my existence that we religious people call redemption. That I
Bingo.
matter, that I'm important. And this is exactly the language that Torah, that Judaism teaches. And as you've said so many times so articulately, the question of what happens after we die is really an extension of that.
Yes.
If you imagine that we're important, then you imagine that and that you believe that we're important, that we matter, then you understand that death doesn't erase that.
No. And
That
the
death
other thing
doesn't
I would
erase
add to it that we are gifted to transmit to the world is the notion of family, which is really the most serious attack from the collapse of American culture. It's the attack on the family and its moral, spiritual, historical value. The declining number of people who decide to get married or who have children out of wedlock, or who look at, worse yet, who look at marriage as a kind of oppression of advanced industrial society. This is another contact point between Judaism and America today.
We'll have to take this up. This is too important a topic just to throw out.
You're right.
The question of how what America's done to family and what can be done to fix it. You're exactly right. I'm not but it's such a big topic. It's such an important topic that
put it in our file cabinet.
We'll wait for a Torah portion that suggests it. I want to answer your other question, which I thought was quite remarkable, which is, so October 7th changed so much for us. On that day, our world shifted radically. It shifted radically first because of the attack upon Israel by the viciousness of Hamas. It has shifted radically because of the rise of worldwide anti-Semitism. It shifted radically because so many of the allies we thought we had turned on us, and so many of the settings in which we have lived our lives, mainly the university, became hostile to us. And the question that you asked is, okay, so what does God want of us at this moment?
Yes.
And it's such a wonderful question. I mean, part of the reason why it's not been asked is, first of all, because we're still shaking, because we're still in that first stage of catastrophe, that the psychologists call denial. Simply, it's a kind of numbness trying to get through the day, and a sort of helplessness as we approach the world. And beyond that, I think it's because, there was a big struggle in Israel to sort of push God out of the picture. Otherwise, you end up with these crazy messianists who invoke God to do some terrible things on both sides, by the way. We have our crazy messianists, and the other side has their crazy messianists. And so the answer was, get all this out of the picture and let's just deal with each other as people. But I think the deepest question of what Israel means religiously and what this means religiously and how it changes our way of looking at the world is a very profound question. It's a very profound question.
It keeps me up at night. It absolutely keeps me up at night. And I think the other part of it is, just to say a final word on my side about Heschel, I have no doubt, whatever doubts I have about the substance of his work and the ability to understand it, I have no doubt at all that Heschel would have written something about the attack on October 7th on October 8th. He had that kind of instantaneous moral compass, and he had that kind of passion. And what I'm noticing is that we don't have a theologian like him.
Right.
He's a generational talent, as they say in baseball. He's just a generational talent that required, by the way, like Maimonides, that required knowledge across disciplines that no other person could master. And it requires, there's no theologian in America. There's really no theologian in the world, a Jewish theologian, who can articulate what we're supposed to do now. What are we supposed to believe now? And the two foci of this agony that we're going through are obvious. First of all, what are we supposed to believe in Israel and about Israel and its place in our life as Jews? And secondly, what are we supposed to believe about the diaspora, about America, about this sort of naive idea that looks completely stupid now, that, there's anti-Semitism isn't that bad, and it's not really that bad, and we've overcome all that. Well, we haven't. And so what do you say about these two great issues? What does Israel mean, and what does it mean to live outside of Israel in a country that is full of hatred for us for no reason that you could possibly imagine?
Right. And then there's a third question, which is what has America discovered about itself through this, right? When you have massive demonstrations supporting vicious terrorism,
Yes,
just vicious terror, and it's coming not from the lunatic, stupid right, but from the lunatic, stupid left,
yes,
from people who are doing it under the banner of social justice and supporting the rape as a political tool and murder of children as a political tool. And there's no sensitivity. There's no sensitivity to like what? Like it's perfectly okay. And I think it's perfectly warranted to demand justice for Palestinians. And it's
yeah.
perfectly warranted to worry and to protest and to demonstrate and say, I hope the Israelis are watching out for civilians. I hope that we can get aid to those people. I have Rahmanis on Palestinian children today, and that's perfectly legitimate. But that you don't support Hamas. Hamas is their problem too. Hamas has kept both populations captive, and where that message got lost, where that moral sophistication got lost, and this Manichaean, good guys, bad guys, blacks and whites, black and white, moral positions. I mean, that everything gets reduced to that simple, you know, justice for this group and to hell with the other group. What happened here? Especially on college campuses.
Right. I'm
So,
thinking
so
about
that's the question. To me, that's a question.
absolutely that has to be added in. And when I saw the presidents of Harvard and Penn and
Right.
MIT testify, okay, it's one thing to to say, there should be
Free
a
speech.
debate, a healthy debate about this. It's another thing altogether to be asked directly, is advocating the genocide of the Jewish people outside the bounds of free speech at Harvard. And for you to respond to that question with, it depends on the context.
Right.
What has happened? What has happened? Not how do you even say that? Forget about whether you should be fired for it. Forget that issue. How could you even say such a thing? I mean, I want to ask all of them, what if you changed the name of the people you wanted to commit genocide against to blacks? What if there were people marching to have a genocide against blacks in America and around the world? Would you have a second of doubt about what these presidents would have said? There is no second of doubt. And I still have to ask my students who write to me, and why do people hate us? And what should be our response to their hatred? I think, to just close this up, this first piece of what's going to be the most important discussion you and I have for years to come, which is what this is. I think the most important theological consequence of the war so far has been the letter by the mother of one of the hostages who was killed, who said, I don't blame you, to the soldiers. I don't blame you because my child was killed by you, by the one of the three who were shot by Israeli, and I don't blame you, and
Yeah.
continue to do what you can do to keep us free. And it was filled with compassion and sorrow and humility and forgiveness. It was immensely moving.
Mm.
Other than that, all I hear is hand wringing and anger against both sides, and people who want to turn this into an election issue, which is obscene. And I just don't know. But Heschel's yahrzeit makes me mourn beyond anything else that whatever it was he would have said, we need someone to be able to say it now.
Yeah. Yeah. He would have called us to a better place.
Yeah.
It's 2024, Mark. I
Yeah.
want to wish you and your family a happy, healthy new year. Let's
Yep.
pray for a turning of the page to something better. And thanks for sharing Shabbos and all this Torah with us. Take good care.
Thanks. I love you. Take
To
care.
everyone, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, Ed.